forest was alive with thunder, not the kind born from clouds, but from the earth itself. Late November 1944, deep in the Hürtgen Forest near the German border, a thin mist clung to the blackened trunks as the morning light struggled through smoke. German infantry crouched in their foxholes, boots buried in frozen mud. Every heartbeat between shells felt like stolen time. Then it came again, a distant whistle, then a scream, and the ground erupted. Trees shattered like matchsticks, shrapnel slicing through the air with the shrill cry of tearing metal. The bombardment rolled forward in perfect rhythm, shell after shell walking across the forest floor. Radio operators tried to call higher command. Silence. Runners never returned. In that moment, one thought dominated every mind. The Americans have found us. They had seen Soviet barrages, British guns, even their own feared Nebelwerfers, but nothing like this. Precision, relentless coordination, the feeling that nowhere was safe. For countless German soldiers on the Western Front, this was the sound of defeat before battle even began. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, its army was small, professional but limited. Its tanks were outdated, its infantry green, and its air force still organizing. Yet one branch of the U.S. military would soon define its battlefield identity: the field artillery. The Americans had learned a harsh lesson in World War I. On the fields of France, U.S. gunners had witnessed the power and the limitations of European artillery doctrines. Static bombardments and rigid fire plans wasted ammunition and time. Communication breakdowns meant that infantry often advanced without support. The result was chaos and carnage. After that war, a generation of U.S. officers swore that if America ever fought again, its artillery would be different, smarter, faster, and more accurate. In the 1920s and 1930s, at places like Fort Sill, Oklahoma, quiet revolutions began. Officers and engineers developed systems that would soon terrify the Wehrmacht: flexible fire direction centers, rapid plotting methods, and radio-linked coordination between forward observers and batteries. Unlike their European counterparts, the Americans envisioned artillery not as a background instrument, but as the main weapon of decision. By 1942, that philosophy became doctrine. Every infantry division was built around its artillery: 3 battalions of 105 mm howitzers, a heavier 150 mm battalion in support, and a command network that could bring multiple units to bear within minutes. It wasn't just about volume. It was about precision. While Germany relied on pre-planned barrages, American gunners trained to adapt in real time. If a platoon was pinned by machine gun fire, forward observers could call in exact coordinates within minutes. The result was devastating efficiency, a barrage that seemed to think along with the troops it supported. As the war expanded from North Africa to Italy, this system matured. Artillery became the silent backbone of every American success. At Kasserine Pass, the inexperienced U.S. Army learned its first painful lessons. But by the time of El Guetar in 1943, those same units had turned the tables, their fire coordination improving so sharply that German panzer divisions found themselves paralyzed under a curtain of steel. Reports from captured German officers described their disbelief at how quickly American batteries could shift fire. In the time it took a German observer to relay a request, U.S. gunners could already be delivering accurate rounds on multiple targets. This wasn't luck. It was organization. It was communication. It was the embodiment of industrial warfare, an orchestra of logistics, technology, and discipline. By 1944, as the Allies prepared for Normandy, U.S. artillery doctrine had reached its peak. Units practiced coordinated time-on-target missions, where dozens of guns across miles would fire so that every shell landed at once. For the men on the receiving end, there was no warning, only sudden, total destruction. And behind every thunderclap lay an unseen machine, the American system that fused mathematics, radio, and manpower into something greater than the sum of its parts. As D-Day approached, that system was ready to be unleashed on a scale the world had never seen. On paper, The German army of World War II possessed some of the most skilled gunners in Europe. Its officers were disciplined, its fire control methods mathematically refined, and its equipment, especially early in the war, of exceptional quality. The 88mm flak gun, a weapon of near mythical reputation, could shatter tanks and aircraft alike. German heavy batteries along the Atlantic Wall were accurate and deadly. Yet as the war dragged into its later years, German artillery found itself outnumbered, outproduced, and increasingly outmaneuvered by a system it had not anticipated: the fast, flexible American model. In 1939, German doctrine treated artillery as a supporting element of combined arms warfare. The Blitzkrieg's lightning thrusts depended on speed, tanks, and radio coordination, not static fire missions. Artillery was mobile but limited. It followed the armored spearhead, providing bursts of fire to break resistance. The philosophy worked brilliantly in Poland and France, where rapid movement overwhelmed defenders before artillery massing became necessary. But by 1943-44, on the Western and Italian fronts, the war had changed. Mobility gave way to attrition. The Germans were now forced to defend, not attack. Every hill and hedgerow became a trap, every defensive line a gamble against time and firepower. In this kind of war, American artillery thrived, and German doctrine began to crack. When the U.S. Army landed in Normandy in June 1944, its artillery immediately demonstrated a level of mobility and communication that stunned German commanders. Thanks to the U.S. Army's vast network of trucks, jeeps, and radios, batteries could shift positions faster than German observers could detect them. The Germans, by contrast, suffered from chronic shortages of fuel, vehicles, and replacement tubes for their guns. Their once superior optical rangefinders and plotting techniques were undermined by a simpler factor: disrupted communication. Allied bombing had shredded telephone lines, destroyed ammunition trains, and forced batteries to operate in isolation. A German artillery battalion might have excellent guns, but without air cover, intact supply routes, or functioning radios, those guns could not respond in time. The Americans, on the other hand, turned radio into their deadliest weapon. Every platoon, every tank, and every forward observer was tied into a communication web feeding back to artillery command posts. This meant that even a small infantry squad pinned down on a French road could summon a rain of 105mm shells within minutes. The result was a fluid, responsive battlefield. American gunners no longer waited for centralized orders. They reacted to live intelligence. Then came the final blow: Allied air superiority. By mid-1944, German artillery crews faced an invisible enemy above. Spotter planes, small unarmed liaison aircraft like the Piper L-4 Grasshopper, hovered silently over the front lines, directing U.S. fire with uncanny precision. To the Germans, these fragile aircraft became a symbol of dread. They knew that where one appeared, American shells would soon follow. Luftwaffe reports from late 1944 admitted that even temporary American observation flights could devastate entire batteries. German counter-battery fire, once effective on the Eastern Front, became sporadic. The moment a German gun fired, Allied spotters triangulated its position, calling in airstrikes or artillery retaliation within minutes. This imbalance was not simply numerical, it was systemic. The Americans had built an entire ecosystem of destruction, logistics, command, communication, and mobility that made their artillery nearly unstoppable once engaged. By autumn 1944, German soldiers in the field began describing American barrages in fearful terms: rolling hell, thunder without pause, the hammer that never missed. And the more the Reich's armies retreated, the more this thunder grew. The U.S. artillery machine was now an industrial storm, following the advancing front with mathematical precision, a storm that would soon define every German soldier's memory of the Western Front. Every soldier in World War II feared artillery, but for German troops on the Western Front, American barrages carried a special terror, a feeling that went beyond simple danger. In the Ardennes, in Normandy, in the frozen forests of Belgium, diaries and letters spoke the same truth. You never knew when it would start. and once it did, there was no escape. Survivors described the ground shaking like the sea during a storm. The air turned thick with dirt and splinters. Trees splintered into shrapnel. The sound was unlike anything else, a shriek that pierced the skull before the explosion even landed. German veterans later admitted that morale collapsed faster under American artillery than under any other weapon. Tanks could be fought, aircraft could be hidden from, but the shells came without warning, and when they struck everywhere. Field Marshal Walter Model once remarked privately that American fire control makes the battlefield itself their ally. He had watched his divisions forced to halt not by infantry attacks, but by fire missions, so precisely timed they severed every line of movement. For frontline troops, the psychological damage was permanent. Men dug into foxholes until their fingers bled, praying for silence that never came. Some refused to move even after the bombardment stopped, convinced it was a trick. Artillery doesn't just kill, it isolates. It cuts soldiers off from their comrades, from orders, from hope. Under sustained fire, the mind fractures. The Germans had long mastered the art of offensive warfare, bold, mobile, confident. But when trapped beneath constant shelling, that confidence evaporated into raw survival instinct. American gunners, meanwhile, saw their craft as both science and duty. Many had never seen their targets. Their war was waged through coordinates, charts, and radios. They called themselves the king of battle, and their sense of precision bordered on pride.
One artilleryman later said, "We never saw the enemy, but we always knew we found them."
On the receiving end, German infantrymen learned a bitter truth. It wasn't courage that decided survival, it was luck. Behind the thunder lay something colder, the quiet logic of engineering. The true power of American artillery wasn't in its size or number, but in the systems that made it sing in unison. Every round fired was the product of a network: surveyors, mathematicians, radio operators, and ballistic experts. At the heart of this system stood a concept called the Fire Direction Center, or FDC. Born from interwar experimentation at Fort Sill, it revolutionized battlefield coordination. Before, artillery relied on preset ranges or guesswork. Now every battery could receive a target's exact coordinates, compute firing data instantly, and adjust for wind, elevation, and powder temperature. This meant that when an American observer called for fire, he didn't just summon shells, he summoned certainty. Even more terrifying was the innovation that arrived in late 1944, the proximity fuse. Developed through secret US and British collaboration, it used tiny radar sensors inside the shell to detonate at an exact height above the ground. Instead of burying itself in the soil, it exploded mid-air, spraying lethal fragments over a wide radius. German troops quickly noticed the difference. Trenches that once offered protection became death traps. Soldiers who once waited out a barrage now found no safety anywhere. Wehrmacht reports called these shells the invisible scythe. Combined with time-on-target techniques, where dozens of guns fired at different intervals so every shell struck simultaneously, the psychological shock was beyond measure. Troops couldn't brace or react. Everything happened in one blinding instant. To the Germans, it felt less like human warfare and more like industrial annihilation. And for the Americans, it was the embodiment of modern war: technology, precision, and teamwork converging to dominate the battlefield. Every shell fired was a message. The United States had learned how to turn calculation into chaos. War is often decided not by bravery but by rhythm, the ability to control time on the battlefield. The Americans mastered that rhythm through artillery. Each infantry division operated its own artillery battalions, but what made them deadly was their ability to combine fire from neighboring divisions, corps, and even army-level guns. A single call for help could bring dozens of batteries into one unified strike. At Normandy, U.S. forward observers could request fire support that arrived within minutes, and not from one battery, but from an entire grid of guns. Each unit adjusted its range, angle, and shell type in synchronization. The result was not scattered shelling but artillery choreography. This responsiveness stunned German commanders. In their army, artillery requests traveled up the chain of command, through telephones or runners, often taking hours. American coordination, by contrast, operated on minutes. This made every German counterattack a gamble. Before armored units could even form up, Shells rained down on their staging areas, breaking momentum before a single tank advanced. During the Battle of St. Lo, observers noted that U.S. artillery walked across the battlefield, shifting fire line by line as infantry advanced behind it. The shelling was so exact that American troops joked it was safer to follow their own barrage than to hide behind cover. German generals began to describe these bombardments as walls of iron. For their troops, it meant every maneuver, every regroup, every retreat, risked being caught beneath perfect timing. Tactics that had once won wars were now crushed under mathematical precision. Artillery had become America's way of dictating the tempo of war. No weapon in World War II inflicted more psychological damage than artillery. It wasn't just the explosions, it was the waiting, the helplessness, the sense that death was coming from nowhere. German letters from Normandy and the Ardennes describe the same unbearable tension. We cannot fight the Americans. We can only endure them. Under U.S. bombardment, even hardened veterans began showing signs of what they called granite fever, shell shock. Men froze at sudden noises, ducked instinctively at the sound of wind over trees, and trembled during silence, expecting the next barrage. Unlike air raids, artillery had no rhythm, no pattern. It came day and night, often precisely when units tried to move or sleep. American observers intentionally timed harassing fire to disrupt rest and morale. For U.S. troops, the opposite effect occurred. Artillery became a symbol of protection, the reassuring thunder that meant support was near. Infantrymen learned to trust the guns behind them completely. The psychological divide widened. One side fought with a sense of invincibility, the other with the dread of being erased without warning. German commanders later acknowledged that artillery's effect went far beyond physical losses. It fractured discipline, slowed movement, and drained courage. Entire companies refused to counterattack through bombardment zones. Even elite SS formations found themselves pinned, paralyzed not by casualties but by fear. In the end, American firepower didn't just kill, it controlled emotion itself. Behind every round fired stood a miracle of organization. The U.S. Army could fight a global war because it had built a machine that never ran dry. Each division consumed thousands of shells per day. Each corps demanded trainloads. Yet thanks to an unmatched industrial base, the supply chain flowed constantly from American factories to European gun lines. Factories in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Illinois worked day and night producing 105mm and 155mm shells. Liberty ships carried them across the Atlantic. Trucks from the Red Ball Express distributed them across France. Even under combat conditions, artillery ammunition rarely ran short. German soldiers often reported hearing American guns fire for hours without pause, something unimaginable for their own forces. The Wehrmacht's logistical system, strained by Allied bombing and fuel shortages, could no longer sustain prolonged fire missions. A single American division could fire more shells in a day than some German corps could in a week. This abundance translated into tactical confidence. American commanders could saturate an area with fire before an assault, adjust instantly, and fire again. German artillery, by contrast, had to conserve every round. The imbalance became absolute. One side rationed destruction, the other unleashed it at will. By 1945, U.S. artillery was no longer just a battlefield arm. It was an extension of America's industrial heart, the sound of a nation's factories echoing across Europe. And for every German soldier caught in its path, that thunder became the most terrifying sound of the war. By the summer of 1944, France was burning. 6 weeks after D-Day, the Allies were still trapped in the hedgerows of Normandy, a labyrinth of sunken lanes and high earthen walls that turned every field into a fortress. Progress came in yards, not miles. The German 7th Army, fighting with desperate skill, held the line against overwhelming numbers. General Omar Bradley, commanding the U.S. First Army, knew that brute force alone would not break the stalemate. What he needed was an earthquake, and the Americans had the tools to create one. In late July, the plan was set. Operation Cobra. Before dawn on July 25, 1944, the U.S. Army unleashed one of the most concentrated artillery and air bombardments in history. Nearly 1,500 guns lined the front, stretching from the coast to St. Lo. Their task? Pulverize a narrow corridor through the German defenses so the armored divisions could burst through. At 6 a.m. the guns opened fire. Observers described it as the earth tearing itself apart. For over 2 hours, the U.S. Army's artillery pounded every ridge, road, and hedgerow sheltering German positions. The 105mm and 155mm howitzers fired in rolling waves, overlapping barrages timed to the second. When the artillery paused, the sky itself ignited. B-17s and B-24s from the 8th Air Force dropped thousands of tons of bombs directly ahead of the American lines. Inside the impact zone, German units ceased to exist as organized formations. The Panzer Lehr Division, among the Wehrmacht's finest, was shredded by the combined assault. Command posts vanished. Radio lines were cut. Survivors wandered dazed through a landscape of smoke and cratered fields. Even German armor, once their symbol of invincibility, was rendered helpless. Tanks were flipped or buried in collapsed roads. Infantry units that tried to counterattack were met by instant American artillery response, called in by forward observers who had advanced almost alongside the fire line. The battlefield had become a living demonstration of modern warfare, the synchronization of land, air, and industrial power. When U.S. armored columns finally rolled forward, resistance collapsed. Roads once guarded by elite divisions became empty. In less than 48 hours, the German front fractured completely. Captured German officers later admitted that they had never witnessed such perfectly timed destruction. The artillery barrages, they said, seemed to arrive from nowhere and end everything at once. Operation Cobra didn't just open France. It broke the myth of German resilience in the West. From that day forward, wherever the Americans went, the Germans feared the sound of guns even before they saw the troops. The thunder of Normandy would echo all the way to the German border. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes forest lay silent beneath a blanket of snow. The trees glistened under pale winter light. American soldiers, believing this sector quiet, warmed themselves in makeshift shelters. Then just after dawn, the silence shattered. From the fog came the thunder of guns, German guns. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt had launched Wacht am Rhein, the desperate counteroffensive later known as the Battle of the Bulge. More than 200,000 German troops and 1,000 tanks smashed into the thinly held American lines. The surprise was total. For the first time since Normandy, the U.S. Army found itself on the defensive. Roads jammed with retreating convoys. Units were scattered and communications failed. Snow and fog grounded Allied aircraft. For 3 days, the Germans advanced unchecked, their columns threading through the forests, crushing outposts, capturing villages. But even as the situation darkened, the Americans still possessed one weapon that never slept: their artillery. The moment the German assault began, American batteries went to work. Firing blind through fog and blizzard, they used every scrap of intelligence, radio intercepts, sound ranging, even muzzle flashes glimpsed through trees, to locate enemy armor. What followed was chaos turned into calculation. In the north near Elsenborn Ridge, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions dug in as German panzer units approached. Their salvation came not from reinforcements, but from their guns. For 2 straight days, American howitzers fired almost without pause, over 10,000 rounds per hour at the height of the defense. The ridge became a furnace of snow, steel, and shattered pine. Observers reported that the landscape itself began to move under the bombardment. The artillerymen, numb with cold and exhaustion, worked until their hands bled. One officer described the guns as breathing monsters, recoiling, loading, and firing in unison. German accounts later admitted the truth. Their advance stalled not because of American tanks, but because of the sheer, unrelenting fire. Columns were broken before reaching contact. The forest roads became graveyards of vehicles. "We could not move," one German survivor wrote. Every path led into a storm of shells. Farther south, around Bastogne, the pattern repeated. When the 101st Airborne became encircled, U.S. artillery outside the pocket, firing from miles away, kept the defenders alive. Using precise radio coordination, they delivered shells directly onto attacking German formations. Even in fog, American spotter aircraft risked the skies to correct fire. General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the Bastogne garrison, later said bluntly, "The artillery won the battle." As the weather cleared and Allied aircraft returned, the full might of American firepower converged once more. Bombers struck from above, guns thundered from below, and the German offensive broke apart. By early January 1945, the bulge was closing. The once proud panzer divisions that had roared through the Ardennes were reduced to ruins, their survivors retreating through blackened forests, littered with shell craters and twisted metal. Artillery had again been the difference between survival and annihilation. But now, it symbolized something greater: the endurance of a mechanized democracy against the last gamble of a fading Reich. The thunder that began in Normandy had now reached the heart of Germany's final stand. By the spring of 1945, the thunder had faded, but its memory remained etched into every battlefield across Western Europe. The forests of Normandy were scarred with craters large enough to swallow tanks. The villages of Belgium and Luxembourg were little more than piles of splintered stone. Roads once filled with columns of German armor now lay quiet, pitted, twisted, and silent. Among the ruins, captured Wehrmacht officers and artillerymen began to speak with grim candor. In interrogation reports preserved by Allied intelligence, a recurring theme appeared again and again. The Americans were the best in artillery. It wasn't admiration. It was resignation. German commanders admitted that they had never encountered such speed and coordination. One officer from the 352nd Infantry Division described the experience bluntly. When the American guns began, there was no place to hide. They fired as if they could see through the ground. Another from Panzer Lehr Division reported that counterattacks routinely failed because U.S. artillery adjusted faster than German forces could maneuver. Before we could even prepare to move, he said, the shells were already falling. It was as if they read our orders. American fire control had reached a level of real-time accuracy that defied German expectations. U.S. batteries used triangulation, radar sound ranging, and constant radio updates from forward observers, allowing them to strike invisible targets with uncanny precision. To the Germans, the effect was psychological as much as physical. Reports from late 1944 onward reveal that morale collapsed fastest among units repeatedly shelled by American guns. Even elite formations like the Fallschirmjäger, once considered unbreakable, began showing signs of fatigue and fear after extended bombardments. At the operational level, German commanders acknowledged an impossible equation. They could no longer mass troops without being annihilated. In an army built on coordination and movement, that meant paralysis. Field reports from the U.S. Army confirmed the opposite effect. American infantry morale rose when artillery was nearby. Units fought longer, advanced farther, and suffered fewer losses when their guns were active. Artillery became more than support, it was security. By April 1945, the U.S. Army's artillery had fired more than 300 million rounds across the European theater. Behind that number lay an industrial miracle, but also a human toll. Gun crews suffered deafness, exhaustion, frostbite, and emotional strain. They slept beside their weapons, ate under bombardment, and fired until their barrels glowed red. Yet even amid fatigue, discipline held. The system, the great network of survey teams, observers, and fire direction centers, never collapsed. As one German general later wrote in a post-war report, the American artillery was not the largest or the heaviest. It was simply the most alive. That vitality, the constant coordinated movement of men, machines, and mathematics, had turned the tide of the Western Front. And by the time the war reached Germany's borders, that living thunder had already broken the Wehrmacht's will to fight. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe lay in ruins. Cities were hollow shells, fields cratered and blackened, bridges twisted into the rivers they once spanned. The war had ended, but the echo of artillery, the endless rolling thunder that defined the American way of battle, did not fade. It became doctrine. In the first post-war studies conducted by both Allied and captured German officers, one conclusion stood beyond debate. No other force in the world had matched the coordination, speed, and adaptability of U.S. artillery. From the deserts of North Africa to the forests of the Ardennes, the system had proven unstoppable once it matured. The U.S. Army itself recognized that its victory was as much industrial and intellectual as it was tactical. Schools like Fort Sill became the beating heart of post-war artillery science. The Fire Direction Center model, born before the war, evolved into a digital command concept decades ahead of its time. NATO partners soon adopted its logic. Flexibility, shared data, and synchronized strike planning as the foundation of Western defense. Meanwhile, across the newly divided Europe, Soviet observers studied the same lessons with wary respect. Their reports described U.S. artillery not as the heaviest, but as the most efficient killing machine ever fielded by a democratic army. In response, the USSR poured vast resources into counter-battery radar, rocket artillery, and massed fire doctrines, all to neutralize the kind of coordination they had witnessed in 1944-45. In this way, the thunder of the American guns continued to shape the Cold War battlefield, a ghostly presence behind every exercise, every deterrence plan, every strategy of rapid response. For the men who had fought beneath those barrages, however, the memory was more intimate. Veterans from both sides remembered the sound above all else, the high-pitched whistle, the momentary silence, then the earth-shaking roar that followed. American artillerymen often spoke with pride, not cruelty, out of their precision. Many never saw the enemy, only maps and coordinates. Yet they knew that each shell carried the weight of victory or survival. German survivors decades later spoke of those same barrages in hushed tones. One Wehrmacht veteran described it simply: "It was like fighting against the weather. You could not stop it. You could only hope it would pass." By 1945, the U.S. Army had proven something the world could no longer ignore: that firepower, when organized, could replace numbers, that calculation could overcome chaos. And as nations rebuilt and new armies formed, the lessons of those barrages became the language of modern war. The war ended, but the system remained, imperfected, studied, and inherited by generations who understood that in the age of machines, the artilleryman's science would always define the rhythm of the battlefield. In every war, there is a sound that defines it. For World War II, that sound was not the scream of dive bombers nor the rattle of machine guns. It was the slow, unrelenting thunder of artillery. For the Germans, it was the sound of inevitability. For the Americans, it was the sound of control. Behind that thunder was not rage but calculation, not chaos but structure. Thousands of men working in harmony, unseen and precise. It was the triumph of organization over impulse, of method over might. In that sense, American artillery became a mirror of the very society that built it: industrial, methodical, and relentlessly focused on efficiency. Yet beneath that logic lay something deeply human. Each shell that screamed through the air was carried there by hands that trembled with exhaustion, by men who had not slept, who lived beside their guns in rain and snow. They did not see their targets. They trusted mathematics, their comrades, and the distant voice on the radio. And for the soldiers who faced them, hidden in forests, crouched in ruined villages, that same sound became the heartbeat of fear. It erased the difference between courage and futility. When the war ended, the thunder ceased, but it never truly left the minds of those who had lived beneath it. It became history's echo, a reminder that victory in the modern age was no longer decided by the strongest soldier, but by the most coordinated system. In the long silence that followed 1945, one truth remained: the Americans had mastered the language of fire, and for those who once fought beneath its storm, that language would never be forgotten.